Well, hello and welcome. I pray that you had a great week. And if you didn't, I pray that this week will be better and that God will take some of the frustrations of the last week and teach you from them and give you deeper insight and help you to focus more specifically on the things now you know you need to pray for. But in light of that, we're looking into continuing our study through Colossians chapter 3, where we've been in the section that I talk about where the rubber really meets the road of life. And we're talking about our relationships. Particularly, we talked about relationships of husband and wives, which I said is central and critical to the health of your children. It's worth every ounce of energy you pour into your marriage for the welfare of your kids. Your kids need to be able to feel like the home is a safe and secure place where they see two people maturely loving each other until death do them part. That's desperately needed in the lives of our young people today, and there are fewer and fewer of them who ever get to see that, which is one of the great tragedies of our era. A nation cannot survive long when its families begin to deteriorate, beginning with divorce and breakup and all the rest that comes with that. Secondly, we talked about the whole issue of parenting, and that is such a multifarious and complicated thing. It's not for the lighthearted. It's not for people who aren't in it for the long haul. As a parent, you really have to be committed to investing yourself and your kids with your time and your energy. We talked about the difference between quality time and quantity time, and in my opinion, you cannot have quality time without putting a quantity of effort into it. Your kids will really remember the times when you weren't there. And you want your kids to be shaped by the interaction they had with you, not by how they learn to function in your absence. And so those are critically important things. And if you need to review some of this stuff, I encourage you to go back and listen to some of these previous devotionals. I have a couple of books that you can find. You can go to our Calvary Spokane website or kenortize.com. You can find the books there. We do have a marriage conference coming up in the first week of March, I think March 3rd and 4th. You can sign up for that and join us at the Coeur d'Alene Resort and on beautiful Lake Coeur d'Alene in the March of next year. If you go to Calvary Chapel Spokane's website, there's a whole archive of my messages, and a lot of them that I've done on marriage. Also, if you go to YouTube, you can find a bunch of stuff. So I'm really recommending that you make kind of a major investment of your time and energy. And you know, if I'm not your jam, then there's a lot of good stuff out there. I just encourage you to find people who will approach the issue of marriage and family from a biblical perspective, which isn't that easy to find anymore, I'm afraid to say. More and more we're coming into an age of the therapeutic model, that psychiatrists and therapists have almost become like a priestly caste. And I have good therapists that I recommend people to who have a Christian foundation and do the work of a therapist from the position of a Christian. And as a scientist, and I appreciate the things that are helpful for me as well. But also there are a lot of those therapists who come from a very unchristian, secular, ungodly frame of reference, and I find that they may be somewhat helpful, but they'll end up trying to direct you in ways that will take you away from the things of God and undermine your faith and not build us up. But with all of that lengthy introduction, I want to continue on by looking at the third category. So the first category was the marriage, the second category was the family, and the last category I called the marketplace. Now, in the context, Paul talks about the relationships of slaves and masters, and that really was pretty much the economic structure of the Greco-Roman world that Paul was speaking into. A large percentage of his people, probably half of the people in the church, were slaves. And we don't know how many of them were masters, but we know that some of them were. The little letter of Philemon really makes that clear. But and I would go on to say that the things that Paul said to slaves and their masters became really foundational in eroding away really the foundation that slavery was built upon in the ancient world. I mean, slavery still is widespread around the world. It's believed there's 30 to 40 million people. I would say there's more like 300 to 400 million people who are living virtually in some form of enslavement. and that an enslavement that basically has the cultural sanction, if not necessarily legal sanction, like you have in India, where the Dalit people, the untouchables, live in virtual slavery and do not have the protection of the law, even though the law has really outlawed the caste system. It is still very much alive and very functional in reality in India and other places around the Far East. But Paul nonetheless said in verse 22 of chapter 3, he said, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eyes are on you to win their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord." Now, there are some people saying, well, what's that going to get you? You're just going to find yourself being held down. Well, one of the things that slave owners have known throughout history, even to the present time, is that slaves can't be trusted because they're slaves. They realize that their service is being forced out of them, and they wouldn't stay one moment longer than they had to if it wasn't for the fact that they were in bondage. And that's been true throughout history. And so basically slaves were watched very closely. They were controlled and oftentimes were marked in various ways with brands or collars or different things that clearly identified. In fact, the idea of having an earring was initially designed in the Middle East for identifying somebody who was a slave. And so basically they knew that they couldn't trust a slave. And Paul says, if you really want to have an impact upon them, then relate to them not as just your earthly masters, which by law and right they were under the Roman system, and not doing just what you're supposed to do when their eyes are on you and then just slacking off when they weren't, but just serve them as if you're serving the Lord. In fact, that's something he goes on to say, that it's just like you're serving Christ. Now, let me tell you, there's a great example of this happening with a guy named Joseph. If you read the book of Genesis, at the last story, the last pericope of the book of Genesis, it's a story of Joseph who is sold into slavery. And he serves just as he's told to do here. He serves his master with all due diligence. And that's why Paul would add in verse 23, he said, "Whatever you do, work at it with all of your heart as working for the Lord and not for men, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as your reward." So it's really, really critically important that we understand that we are being a witness for God. And if we translate this into the workplace, basically we come to understand that God will reward us and enable us to be a witness for him just by the faithfulness of how hard we work. Now, I say this in some ways kind of chuckling, because I remember once I was at the airport waiting to catch a flight, and I was eating some food, and I watched an employee there who was supposed to be cleaning tables, and I could tell his heart wasn't in it, because he just was standing at the table rubbing the same rag around the same table over and over again without moving. And suddenly the manager came out from behind. He got really busy and started working really fast, and then the manager went back behind into the kitchen, and he just stopped again and started moving the rag back and forth. And I thought to myself, there's more work in avoiding work than actually doing the work. Because when you do the work, first of all, you have the satisfaction that you've done the work. Secondly, people around you recognize that you can be counted on, that you're trustworthy and you're reliable. One of the scariest things in our country right today, it doesn't even get talked about, is there are over 7 million able-bodied men between the ages of 18 and 64 who intentionally are avoiding not working and finding ways to continue to support themselves, either by living on the dole or living in their parents' basement. And this is really a tragedy to our country, because we need people who contribute in a substantial way to the economy of the country, and it drags all of us down when we have people who are freeloaders. And so essentially what he's saying, that when you have a job, you should work at it with all of your energy. That was always my principle, simply because I knew that God would reward me for my faithfulness regardless of what I did. And tell me, I worked in factories a lot when my wife and I were first married, and I would repeatedly have people there, guys working there, telling me to slow down. I was working too hard, because it said, you're making us look bad. They had a system where they worked a minimum amount of energy and produced just a minimum level, because basically they didn't want to have to work harder, but it was also a way of kind of holding the business hostage. And so, because in their mind was, if the business makes more money, we're not going to get more money, so why should we bless them? And they developed an adversarial view towards the managers and their employers. What Paul says is, don't do that. You need to serve with sincerity of heart, earnestly. But I'm out of time. We'll continue this conversation. I want to delve into this a little bit deeper tomorrow. God bless you and go in his grace.